This is the Fujifilm GF20-35mm f4 ultra wide angle zoom lens. Now, it's the first wide angle zoom lens for the GFX medium format system, and as someone who shoots a lot of wide angle landscapes, I'd been interested in this from when it was first announced, and I've just been really eager to use it. Now, before this came out, if you wanted to shoot wide angle on the GFX system, you were limited to the 23mm f4 prime, which is a really great lens. I used that a lot in Namibia last year when I was shooting in Kolmanskop in the ghost town there. But that has a full frame equivalent of about 18mm, which is wide, but sometimes you really do need to go a little bit wider than that. Now, this lens has a focal length equivalent of 16 to 28mm on full frame equivalent, which is really wide, and you can see the difference between 23mm and 20mm here. Now, that extra little bit really does help sometimes to compose wide angle compositions, and it's something that I do find really useful, and I'm also really attracted to the flexibility of a zoom lens. So I took this lens with me to Lofoten last month to put it through its paces shooting landscapes there. Now, Lofoten is a place where I generally tend to shoot quite a lot of wide angle images. There's a lot of coastal work there down by the ocean, and it also has a lot of mountains. So it's a good place to put this through its paces. Now, this isn't going to be a super technical review looking at MTF charts or things like that. What concerns me is what kind of output I can expect from this. What are the quality of images from this lens going to be like when I'm out shooting in the field? Now, first impressions of this is that it is a really, really well-made lens. Right out of the box, it just has that premium feel that you get from all of the GFX lenses. It just feels really solid and like a really well-made lens. Now, how big and bulky this feels to you really depends on where you're coming from. So if you're comparing it with something like the 10-24 on the X system, then obviously it's going to feel like a much bigger lens. But for what this actually is on the medium format system, it actually feels like a compact and relatively lightweight system. I was actually surprised at how light it was. It reminds me a lot of the 17-35mm that I used to use when I had a full frame Nikon system. And what surprised me is that despite having the same aperture value as the 23mm, it's actually 100 grams lighter than that lens. It's also smaller and lighter than the 8-16 on the Fuji X system. So I think they've done a really good job here of keeping the weight down and making a relatively compact lens on a focal range which traditionally has relatively large, heavy lenses. Now, of course, it's a weather-resistant lens. It's sealed against dust and moisture entering and things like that, so you should be able to use this without any fear. I put that to the test in Lofoten. This got rained on, it got snowed quite heavily on, it got splashes from the water, and nothing really seemed to affect it. Like all of the GFX lenses that are weather-resistant, I've used them in some quite harsh conditions and not had any problem with them at all. The zoom on the lens is completely internal, so it doesn't extend at all when you zoom in or out. And all the rings are rubberized and have really nice, easy operation, even when you're wearing gloves. Now, at the front here, you've got the focus ring, which has a nice level of resistance, which is very important to me. I shoot manual for most of my landscapes, so being able to get really precise focusing is important, and having good resistance in the ring is important for that. Then you've got the zoom ring, which again also has a really nice level of resistance. It's really nice and wide, and you can go through the entire zoom range in just a quarter of a turn, so it's easy to operate just with one hand. And then at the back, you've got the aperture ring, which just has really solid clicks on each third of a stop. And then right at the end, you've got the C or control mode, which allows you to control the aperture through the dials in the camera rather than here on the lens. Now, there's no button here on the lens for OIS, for optical image stabilization. So if you're using one of Fuji's older GFX cameras that doesn't have optical stabilization, then this isn't going to be a stabilized lens. And also it takes filters. It's got an 82mm diameter filter ring, which is again something I find really useful in an ultra wide angle lens, because I tend to shoot a lot near the ocean with ND filters where I want to slow down the exposure a little bit to get some kind of blur in the water. Okay, so right out of the camera, I was really impressed with the image quality from the lens. There's just a detail to the images that you can see in Lightroom without zooming in, and all of the images just have this really punchy, contrasty feel. I've not been able to find any chromatic aberration at all. It just feels like a very well-performing lens. But let's have a look in a little bit more detail at what kind of image quality you can expect from the lens. So this is a selection of images shot in Lofoten at different focal lengths and slightly different apertures. This is what I'm really interested in seeing, is what kind of image quality I can expect from this lens when I'm shooting in the field in field conditions. So let's have a look at this image. Now this is shot at 20mm. It's the widest focal length on the lens, and at f8, and all of these images were shot on a tripod. So if we zoom in here, you can see that there's just a huge amount of detail here in the edges of the ice and the snow on top of this rock. It really is nice. The detail here it's rendering here is fantastic. But as you move further into the image, this softening here, this is because it's out of focus. And I think this is something that you get shooting medium format, is there is a lot less depth of field. So much less than when you're shooting full frame, and even less than when you're shooting with an APS-C. And I think that's particularly relevant with wide angle zooms, because they lend themselves to this kind of composition where you have a foreground closer to the lens and a background that's much more distant. And it's in these kind of scenes where it's always going to be impossible to get the whole scene in focus. You have to shoot basically multiple different images and focus stack them. So you can see this is the image I shot, which was with the midground and the background in focus. And the detail here in the grass right up to the edges, it's just a huge amount of detail here. Every blade of grass, every twig is just so sharp, rendered so beautifully. And when we look up into the mountains, there's so much detail there. This is another image. This is shot at close to 30mm at 29mm. Again, this is focus stacked. I think this first image is the image that I shot for the mountain with the first light on it. This is at f11, again using a tripod. And yeah, it's just rendering so much detail there in the mountain. The midground here, because it's slightly underexposed, we can't see the detail so much. But let's have a look at the next image to look at the exposure I made for the foreground. And again here, you can see the barnacles on this rock. If we go over to the left side, the seaweed here, that really is, this is a raw image. I haven't done anything to it, but there's really punchy contrast and just so much detail. And it's just so smooth. There's no noise there at all. It really is beautifully rendered. Now, this is shot at 20mm, and this one, because it's not focus stacked, we can zoom right into the middle and see how sharp we get right in the middle of the image. There's nothing here that's particularly close to the camera, so this was the kind of frame that I could shoot and get all of the scene in focus. And yep, just loads of detail in the rocks there. When we look into the cabins, we can just see how sharp it is. Now with focal lengths this wide, you're always going to have some kind of distortion. You can see here that this goes off the vertical, the verticals here in the center of the image. But as we get over to the left, you can see that the verticals on the right kind of lean out and you get keystoning. That's something that you're going to get on pretty much every wide angle that's not a tilt and shift lens. So it's not really distortion, not the kind of distortion that you get with the horizons off center. I haven't noticed any of that. This is a really well-corrected rectilinear lens. But of course, yes, when you get to the edges of the frames, then the verticals won't always stay vertical. But just looking at the detail here in this house in the background, it really is rendered beautifully well. Now this image is one of the few that I've got at the other end of the focal length on the lens. This is shot at f9 at 32, close to 33mm. I tend to not shoot with that end of the lens that much. For those kind of images, I'm usually using the mid-range zoom. And looking at this, the detail is really nice, but it doesn't seem to me, when I look at the writing on the gravestones here, it doesn't seem to me to be rendered quite as sharply as at the wider end of the lens. So I'm wondering if there's a little bit of drop off in sharpness when you zoom it to the longer end and it's sharper at the wider end. I mean, this is still a beautifully rendered image. It's beautifully sharp, but it certainly doesn't seem to be as sharp as the wider images. And then just one more image. This is again at 20mm at f8. Now here I know that I focused in the middle, so right at the bottom here there's a little bit of a drop off in the depth of field, but when we get into the middle of the image, you can see just all the detail here, the bits of grass breaking through the water, all the detail around the grass. Let's just move into these rocks here and these houses on the other side. It really does render a lot of detail. Now, those are all images shot in the field, and I'm really super happy with the lens, but I did want to have a look at how the lens performed across different aperture ranges and have some direct comparisons. So we'll look here at these images which are taken at 20mm at different focal lengths. So we've got f14, f8 and f4. Now, the first things that you'll notice when I flip between these is that at f4, when it's wide open, the lens does vignette. You can see the center is more or less the same. The edges are actually a lot darker at f4, so there is a little bit of light drop off wide open. You can see though between f14 and f8, there's no difference whatsoever. So shooting with the lens wide open, you are going to get a little bit of light fall off. I'd say that's about a stop, maybe a little bit less than that. It's hard to measure, but definitely it does vignette when it's wide open. So let's zoom in and have a look at the detail and compare it. So here on the left, you've got f4, and on the right, you've got f8. It certainly does look a little bit sharper at f8, but there's really not that much difference in the center of the lens. But the differences will always be when you go up into the corner. So we head it right up into the top corner here. And if we look at the detail in the railings here, you can see that at f4, it's still, I mean, that performs better than something like the 10-24, but you can see that there is a drop off in sharpness when the lens is wide open at f4. I suspect if we go into the bottom corner, we're going to see something similar in the paving stones there. Yep, these look definitely a lot less sharp. Now, if we look at f8 and f14, let's zoom in again and move to the center. Now again, there's not really much difference, but it seems to me that f8 is a tiny little bit sharper around the plants here. Let's go up into the top corner again and see what the difference is in the top right corner. There's really not a lot of difference, but again, I would say at f8 it is slightly sharper than at f14. Now with medium format, diffraction affects lenses differently. You can generally at f14 on an APS-C lens, I'd be starting to worry about diffraction. That shouldn't really be the case with medium format. But even so, I generally don't like shooting above f14. And it does look to me like f8 is a little bit of a sweet spot. It's very little difference there, but it does look a tiny, tiny, tiny bit sharper at f8 than it does at f14. Now these images are all shot at the other end of the focal length at 35mm, and again you can see here that the f4, if we look in the corners when we go to f8, it brightens up. So again, you do get that light fall off all the way through the focal range. So let's just have a look at two side by side. So on the left here you've got f4, and on the right you've got f8. I would say that again, very little difference in the center of the lens. F8 does look sharper. As we get into the corners, I think that there's a more significant fall off here. We can see the difference in the tiles here at f4 to at f8. I think, how close are you? We're right into the corner now. I think there is a bigger fall off at wide open apertures at the longer end than there is at the wider end. Now we've got f8 and f14 again. Just looking at the pot plant here, actually f14 looks slightly sharper here at this focal length, certainly in the center. Let's check the corner again, looking up at the tiles where there's lots of detail. And interesting, this actually, the f14 does feel to me sharper here than the f8 lens at this end of the focal length. And we'll just look at one last image which I took in my apartment. So if you're interested in architecture or shooting interiors, this is a very different kind of shot. This is shot at ISO 400, again on a tripod, f7.1 at 20mm at its widest. Now, I did quite a few test shots here, looking at these books with different focal lengths of telephoto lenses, and really this is probably one of the sharpest lenses that I've ever tested. It really does produce a huge amount of detail. I mean, we can zoom in, try zooming into 200% here. And yeah, at 200%, obviously the image is always going to start to break up, but it really does surprise me how much detail this lens actually renders. Now, bearing in mind what you're seeing is a screen recording of the images, which is then being compressed to video and then compressed to upload it onto YouTube. So you're not seeing the same level of detail that I'm seeing here as I look at them on my screen. But as I said at the beginning of the video, the detail that this lens produces really is impressive. It's just something that I do like using. As soon as I look at it in Lightroom, the detail really just seems to pop out. It renders landscapes so beautifully, and it is probably for me the best landscape lens that I've ever used. So this is an excellent lens which I have really enjoyed using, and for me it kind of completes the GFX system. When I first tested the system about 5 years ago, I did feel that the one thing it was really lacking was an ultra wide angle zoom. When I invested in the system myself last year, when I got the GFX 100, I held off from getting the 23mm and waited for this because Fuji had already announced this at that point. So which is the better lens? Which is the better choice? Which should you go for, this one or the 23mm prime? Well, they've got the same aperture performance and they're pretty much the same price. Well, they certainly are here where I live in Portugal, and a similar size, although this one is slightly lighter. Now, it's a shame that I've not been able to give a direct comparison with the 23mm because I don't have one here with me. But it being a prime lens, for sure, it's going to have better optical performance. But how much better? I mean, this does have incredibly good optical performance. I'm really, really happy with this. So what you're going to have to do is just balance that slightly better optical performance against the range and flexibility that you have from this zoom. It's got a wider maximum focal length of 20mm, which I do find useful because I do like to shoot ultra wide. And so for me, I am really happy with this lens. Now, it's not cheap, but none of the GFX lenses are. It's a medium format system, and I don't think anyone invests in that system expecting the lenses to be cheap. But for me, this is something that I know I'm going to get a lot of use out of for a long, long time. And it really does complete an excellent trinity with the 35-70 and the 100-200. Those three lenses are not actually that heavy and just give me pretty much everything that I want from 99% of landscape photography shooting. So that's it for this video. I hope it's been useful and I hope it's been interesting. If there's anything I've missed, if you've got any questions, just drop me a comment down below and I'll get back to you, or send me an email. And if you like my photography, if you like the way that I shoot, you can come along and join me on a workshop. I'm heading back to Lofoten next year. I'll also be in Iceland, in Greenland, in Namibia, in Patagonia. You can find full details of all my workshops on my website. So have a look there if you're interested. I'd love to have you join me on a trip. And as ever, thanks for all the support of the channel. Good luck with all your photography and take care. See ya.